Founded in 2002, NALCAB, the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, is the hub of a national network of over 140 mission-driven organizations in 40 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico that serve hundreds of thousands of low and moderate income people. Our mission is to strengthen the economy by advancing economic mobility in Latino communities across the United States.
True to our name, NALCAB and our members are focused on asset building. We want to help members of the Latino community to build assets, to own homes, start new businesses, manage their finances, build credit, repair credit, so that they can advance economically. We view economic mobility as an agent for achieving social justice.
Members of the NALCAB network invest in their communities by building affordable housing, addressing gentrification, supporting small business growth, and providing financial counseling on issues such as credit building and home ownership. Since 2008, with NALCAB support, member organizations have secured nearly $450 million for affordable housing, small business, and financial capability programs. We've directly awarded over $25 million in grants and have provided training to more than 2,500 practitioners. Through signature programs like the Pete Garcia Community Economic Development Fellowship and our annual training webinars and workshops, NALCAB prepares next-generation leaders and empowers community development professionals with the skills and tools they need to best serve their communities. NALCAB works to ensure the Latino perspective is included in public policy discussions to boost the economic trajectory of Latinos in the U.S. and the economy as a whole. We are actively involved in research, national partnerships, and efforts to raise the profile of issues affecting our communities, as well as policy solutions to achieve diversity, inclusion, and economic equality. NALCAB has been a leading voice in making sure that COVID relief and recovery legislation target those most negatively impacted by the pandemic: Latino families, small businesses, and essential workers. We have also been at the table with policymakers on immigration reform, consumer protections, and ensuring robust funding of key federal funding streams that uplift low and moderate income communities. We are a respected resource for policymakers and draw on the expertise and experiences of our member organizations that are on the front lines. Additionally, we support our members in engaging with policymakers on ways to strengthen their local communities.
The way that Latinos are driving the recovery post-pandemic in this economy is that they actually never really stopped working during the pandemic. Latinos are the essential workers. They're the frontline workers. They're working in industries that never stopped, and they will continue to persevere and continue to lead the charge of growing this economy after this is over.
Even through the challenges of COVID-19 and the economic pandemic, the NALCAB organization continues to grow, expanding our programming staff and network reach, identifying new funding sources and partnerships, and serving as a leading economic voice for Latinos across the country. We look forward to working closely with our partners and member institutions to ensure opportunity and equity for all. Juntos somos más. Together, we are more. Good morning, and welcome to NALCAB's second annual Latino Economic Policy Summit, Leading America's Recovery. I am Sharon Garcia, Director of Communications for NALCAB, the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, and we have a great agenda planned for you today that will be informative and timely, as well as interactive. We'll start off the day with keynote speaker US Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who serves as the chair of the US House Financial Services Committee. NALCAB President and CEO Marla Bolanek will then facilitate a Q&A session with Representative Waters, where attendees can ask questions via the chat module located on the right-hand side of your screen. Later this morning, we will have remarks from US Congressman Dr. Raul Ruiz,
chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, a conversation with Councilmember Nancy Navarro, the very first Latina to be elected to the Montgomery County, Maryland Council, a message from Senator Mark Warner, and a call to action on voters' rights from US Congresswoman Linda Sanchez. We encourage you to tweet your comments and questions using our hashtag Latino Economic Engine, and follow the tweets page on this platform to view real-time commentary from our sessions today. If you have any technical issues, please go to the support tab on this platform to request help. And any other questions you might have about today's event, please shoot us an email at nalcabconference@thebelcomegroup.com, the email that you will see in the chat box. We are also streaming today's Policy Summit via Facebook Live on NALCAB's Facebook page. We have a full agenda ahead, so let's get started. To kick things off, I would like to introduce Marla Bolanek, the President and CEO of NALCAB. Marla is a national leader in community economic development with more than 20 years of experience in small business development, community-based financial services, and international aid, with an emphasis on Latin America and the US Latino population. A graduate of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Marla is a board member of the Opportunity Finance Network, the National Housing Trust, and a founding member of the National League of Minority Voters Board. It is my great pleasure to welcome Marla Bolanek to our virtual stage.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning and bienvenidos. My name is Marla Bolanek, President and CEO of NALCAB. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you joining us for NALCAB's second annual Latino Economic Policy Summit. As you heard in our live opening video, NALCAB's mission is to strengthen the economy by advancing economic mobility in Latino communities. We focus on asset building and empowering Latino communities across the U.S. to thrive and prosper. NALCAB views economic mobility, access to capital, and financial stability as agents for achieving social and economic justice. Latinos are driving the recovery of the COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. with an annual economic output of $2.7 trillion. As GDP, this is equal to 7th in the world above countries such as Canada, Italy, or Brazil. U.S. Latino consumption pumps $1.85 trillion into the U.S. economy every year, nearly identical in size to the entire economy of Texas. With a population of 62.1 million as of the 2020 U.S. Census, Latinos are now the largest minority group in the country. The numbers are clear. Latinos are a vital engine for the U.S. economy. We are a force to be reckoned with, and when Latino families and businesses prosper, we all prosper. A large part of NALCAB's work relates to public policy, advocacy, and supporting federal and state programs that aid low and moderate income communities. The Latino Policy Summit was born out of a need to have a seat at the table when it comes to discussions and decisions that directly impact policy. We know that change will not happen if we are on the sidelines when policy decisions are being made. Today's Policy Summit is an opportunity to voice our policy priorities, be a part of the national dialogue, and advocate for change in order to break down the systemic barriers that stifle our prosperity. The future strength and competitiveness of our economy relies on achieving far broader financial inclusion and ultimately greater economic mobility for all people living in the U.S. Today, we are very pleased to bring to you an incredible lineup of policymakers and change makers who are breaking barriers to advance economic equity and rejuvenate our economy. During the day, we'll hear from elected officials, industry experts, national leaders, and influencers shaping the future and paving the way for Latinos and communities of color to lead in this nation's post-pandemic recovery and beyond. Thank you so much to the NALCAB team and our partners for making this virtual event possible. To get things started, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome US Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Chair of the House Financial Services Committee and one of the most powerful women in American politics today. She's an ally and staunch advocate for policies that advance the work and communities that NALCAB and our members care so much about, both in her home district as well as nationally. Elected in November 2018 to her 15th term in the House of Representatives for the 43rd Congressional District of California, Congresswoman Waters made history as the first woman and first African American chair of the House Financial Services Committee. Throughout her more than 40 years of public service, Representative Waters is known for tackling difficult issues related to poverty, economic development, and equal justice under the law. She has combined her strong legislative and public policy expertise with an unusual ability to do grassroots organizing and foster bipartisan support. Congresswoman Waters has also gained a reputation as a fearless and outspoken advocate for women, children, people of color, and the poor. She has led congressional efforts to mitigate foreclosures and keep American families in their homes during the housing and economic crises. She authored the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which provides grants to states, local governments, and nonprofits to fight foreclosures, home abandonment, and blight, and to restore neighborhoods. An integral member of the Congressional Democratic leadership, Congresswoman Waters serves as a member of the Steering and Policy Committee and is also a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and member and past chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. It is my great pleasure and honor to invite to our virtual stage Congresswoman Maxine Waters. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us today.
Very pleased to join you for this event, especially during Latinx Heritage Month. I'd like to begin by thanking you for inviting me to your conference. I would also like to personally thank Marla Billernick for that kind introduction, and congratulations on your new role as President and CEO of the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders. Your hard work during the pandemic and your support of my committee's efforts to bolster community development financial institutions, commonly referred to as CDFIs, have proven invaluable in ensuring that Latinx communities receive needed capital investments. As you understand all too well, communities of color, including minority-owned businesses, have been systematically excluded from financial services, access to capital, basic banking services, housing opportunities, and racial and economic justice. For example, one study by Stanford Business School showed Latinx businesses have a 60% lower chance of getting loan approval from national banks compared to their non-Hispanic white counterparts. According to a Federal Reserve survey, 30% of Latinx households were unbanked or underbanked. The urgent need for relief during the pandemic made this worse. For example, a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research noted that Latinx business owners at the height of the pandemic dropped by 32%. My committee has been focused on such barriers created by systemic racism in the housing and financial systems and has been advancing legislation to provide targeted investments and to remedy injustices and close the racial wealth gap. With funding from the CARES Act to support the Minority Business Development Agency, the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce was able to support more than 6,000 Latinx and minority-owned businesses through its 7 technical assistance centers at chambers across the country, while also hosting over 100 webinars and virtual trainings to help business owners recover during the pandemic. We also work tirelessly to ensure that CDFIs, as well as minority depository institutions, known as MDIs, received critical dollars to support small businesses and minority-owned businesses. We saw discrimination in the Paycheck Protection Program, commonly referred to as PPP. So according to an August 2020 report from the Stanford Latino entrepreneurship initiative, Latin-owned businesses were half as likely than their white counterparts to receive all the funding they applied for in the PPP loans. In the second PPP round, I worked with Small Business Committee Chair Velasquez to secure a $60 billion set aside for community leaders, including credit unions, CDFIs, and MDIs, to provide PPP loans. Additionally, in the Consolidated Appropriations Act for fiscal year 2021, I worked out a bipartisan deal to include $12 billion in new capital investments and grants to support CDFIs and MDIs. And in June, I joined Vice President Harris, Secretary Yellen, and Senator Warner to announce the first $1.25 billion of those funds that were being dispersed to CDFIs. But I also want you to know that our work is not done. Housing has always been a top priority for me, and so of course I didn't just stop pushing for more resources for housing once we passed the American Rescue Plan. I introduced 3 pieces of groundbreaking housing legislation. The Housing is Infrastructure Act of 2021 would provide a historic investment of over $600 billion in equitable, affordable, and accessible housing infrastructure. The Ending Homelessness Act of 2021 would end homelessness and significantly reduce poverty in America by transforming the Housing Choice Voucher Program into a federal entitlement. The Down Payment Toward Equity Act of 2021 would help address the United States racial wealth and homeownership gaps by providing $100 billion toward down payment and other financial assistance for first-generation homebuyers to purchase their first home. According to estimates from the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, the Latinx homeownership rate increased for the 6th consecutive year in 2020 to between 48 and 49% compared to a non-Hispanic white home ownership rate of over 73%. This is what is really needed to solve the housing crisis and close the racial wealth gap in this country. We know that Latinx households are overrepresented among people experiencing homelessness and are more likely to be renters and at risk of eviction despite a steady rise in Latinx home ownership rates over the last few years. Although the Build Back Better Act does not include the full investment I propose, it is a step in the right direction. A few weeks ago, my committee passed provisions for the Build Back Better reconciliation package. This $327 billion package makes up for decades of underinvestment and help create, preserve, or retrofit at least 3 million homes, provide 750,000 new housing choice vouchers, allocate resources for public housing in disrepair, support first-generation home buyers, including nearly 3 million estimated Latinx home buyers, distribute targeted funding for rural communities, including to increase and improve farm worker housing stock, and provide robust investments to strengthen fair housing enforcement to combat illegal housing discrimination. My committee also included $3 billion for the Minority Business Development Agency to provide direct assistance and grants to support both our communities, entrepreneurs, and the jobs they create. The funding provided in this bill will be transformational. However, the funding levels and text continue to be negotiated and may change as it moves through the House and Senate. And I am concerned that some are looking to cut these important housing and business investments. And I want you to know that I will fight to ensure that housing and support for minority-owned businesses are part of any package. So I look forward to working with the National Association for Latino community asset builders to enact the Build Back Better Act, to push for resources for CDFIs, MDIs, and housing, and ensure such investments benefit underserved communities across this country. And I want to thank you for our long time relationship and again, the work that you've done in support of my committee. Together, we can get things done and we can rid this country of the kind of racism and lack of support that we've witnessed for far too long. We're making headway and we must keep working to ensure that there is justice and equality for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Waters. We are just beside ourselves that you're here with us today. It's truly an honor, and we are so grateful for all of the work that you do that really advances the agenda of NALCAB and our members. So we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. We're so grateful that you're willing to take questions from our participants. I'm going to get it kicked off with a question that we had prepared, which is around the Community Reinvestment Act. So the committee, as you know, has been active in its oversight responsibilities regarding CRA. Recently, the OCC rescinded its rule and the regulators have said that they're working together. What is next for the committee regarding CRA?
Well, let me just say that when we had the previous head of OCC, who was headed in the wrong direction with what he called the modernization of the Community Investment Act. We are pleased that there's a halt to the direction that he was going in. We have to make sure that the Community Reinvestment Act realizes the original mission for which it was intended, and that is investment in the communities where they have branch bankings, they have banks, and they should be not only supplying assistance for mortgages, but also making sure that the community is receiving the kind of support which we've never seen before, and that we're able to have access to the kind of resources that will help to close the wealth gap, will ensure that we get the mortgages, and ensure that we don't have banking deserts rather than real banks that are carrying out the Community Reinvestment Act.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I could not agree more with all of your comments. A second question that we had, and you touched on this in your remarks, but many of us believe that housing is infrastructure and a civil rights issue. You've been a champion in this space, but it has not been easy in the current political climate. What are you doing, and how can we help combat efforts to scale back housing support and or remove housing provisions from the Build Back Better plan?
Well, let me just tell you that I made it a priority to get housing included this year in the infrastructure bill. You know, traditionally, infrastructure is considered, repair of bridges and highways and roads and water systems. And I agree with all of that. But I have forced the understanding that housing is infrastructure and that it must be included in infrastructure legislation. So we got it in the reconciliation bill, and we went for it with the big numbers. We have in that bill $90 billion for vouchers for Section 8 and for project-based Section 8. We have in that bill $70 billion for public housing, repair and renovations and upkeep. We have in that bill more money for CDBG for our cities. We have in that home money for the home program. We also have in that an increase in funds for the National Housing Trust Fund so that we could get more units built for the developers who are interested in developing affordable units and apartment buildings, etc. And of course, we have $13 billion in for first-time home buyers, first-generation home buyers. And so this is comprehensive. And we wanted to show that we were serious. And so, yes, the reconciliation bill is still in negotiation. We're going to have to fight to hold on to what we have created. It's a struggle, since, of course, we have the Republicans joined by two so-called Democrats who are reducing the 3.5, I believe it is, trillion bill that we want for all of the reconciliation. And they want to make it about $1 trillion. And it looks as if the president is saying no less than 1.5 trillion to 2 trillion. And so the negotiations is going on. And we're going to fight for housing because we think it is so very important. The kids can't go to school sleeping in cars. You can't get up and go to work without having a place to shower and change clothes and to keep your clothes. You cannot exist without safe and secure housing. And that's what we're fighting for. And we're going to do everything that we can to not get rolled over in these negotiations that are going on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And just one thing to your point that you mentioned in your comments, that this was the sixth consecutive year that Latino homeownership grew, even despite the setbacks from COVID. And what's interesting is that the barrier that seems to be presenting itself, the highest barrier, is inventory. So the fact that you're, totally behind the Housing Production Trust Fund is very encouraging, because we need to get more and more affordable housing, developed and in place so that our Latino homeowners can go out and get what is theirs, as well as really everyone in the United States. It's certainly a basic human right. So thank you for that. So I've got a question from the audience.
Yes.
I'll just pull it up here. So the 2020 midterms are drawing close. What questions can we ask candidates running in our districts to make sure that we're electing the next generation of housing champions?
Well, this is an area that I think none of our communities have been strong enough on. What we find is most of our communities are much too kind to the elected officials. And when they come to be with them in town halls or community meetings, and now even in the virtuals, they fail to ask the tough questions. And they usually basically want to show the elected officials that they're appreciative for them and that they will work with them. But I think that we're going to have to do better. And just as you're raising these questions, let us focus on a few of these areas. Number one, we want to know exactly what they have done dealing with the pandemic, and how did they support the CARES Act? Did they support the President's American Rescue Plan? Did they support the additional money that we were given to the unemployed to assist them with meager unemployment benefits that certainly would not have put food on the table and gas in the car and all of those things? That was very important. And we want to know what did they do about PPE, the equipment that was needed for our frontline workers. And you want to ask them, do you know that frontline workers, that Latinx workers make up the majority of frontline workers? They're on the line providing goods and services for us every day. Did you work to make sure that they had the equipment that they needed? Because we got reports that they did not. And so we want to know, what did you do? Did you write a letter? Did you call your county? Did you talk with your legislature? What did you do to ensure that there was protection for the frontline workers? What are you doing about immigration reform? Where do you stand? What are you doing about DACA? These are young people who have played by the rules. They have gone to college. They have degrees oftentimes. They many times didn't know that their parents had brought them here when they were very young and that they were not documented. And so, are you involved in the fight to make sure that they are able to stay in the only country they really know and have been here, since they were very young? You want to know what they're doing about business. PPP was very important. And of course, after the big banks created their portals and took care of the concierge clients, we had to come back with additional money. You want to ask them, did you support PPP and directing more money to small and minority-owned businesses? And were you willing to stand up when the big banks gave out the biggest share of the money in the first iteration of PPP? And so these are some of the tough questions on housing, business, support in this pandemic, position on immigration reform, particular support for DACA, on and on and on. Is so much, but be direct. And as my grandmother would say, don't beat around the bushes, go to it and ask the questions and see what those answers are. Then check their records and see what they have co-authored, what they have authored, and what they voted for. Do the checking of the records, because I think this will help you to understand who and what legislators are doing.
Absolutely. This is really great guidance for us and how we can be influential in our own communities. So we're so grateful for that feedback. I've got one last question for you, which is also from the audience. Given what you mentioned about Biden wanting to trim down the reconciliation bill, what is an absolute non-negotiable for your office as you go into negotiations?
Well, my number one priority is housing. As a chair of the Financial Services Committee, I am absolutely outraged and cannot continue to walk over bodies in our communities. And it is not just as what they call Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, for example, all over the country. In our urban areas, in our rural areas, people are sleeping on makeshift tents. They're sleeping under cardboard. And America can do better than this. And that is a top priority for me. However, I want to be as logical as I can possibly be and looking at everything that's in the Reconciliation Act and looking at the child care and looking at the extension of health care and looking at education. And can we reduce or eliminate the cost of our junior colleges? I'm going to look at it all. And I believe that what you don't do is you don't just take one area and clear it out and cut it all. We all may have to share a bit across the board and making sure that we're able to maintain in all of these areas and not eliminate, because so many of them are so very important. We've got to get rid of homelessness. We've got to increase the wealth gap and make sure that the resources are available to our small businesses, because in the final analysis, small businesses create more jobs than the big businesses do. So I want to be as fair as I can possibly be, and I want to not have any one of these areas just wiped out. Let us all share a little bit and be able to maintain so that we can move forward in all of the areas to increase the possibility of having a decent way of life for all of us.
Absolutely. A very balanced and cooperative approach, which also mirrors your very kind cooperation in our event today. I just want to, again, thank you so much for being with us. It's been such a pleasure, and it's so inspiring to hear from you. So thank you so much, Congresswoman Waters, and we hope that you have a great rest of the day. And we're so grateful again for your participation today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to continue to work with you.
Likewise. Have a great day. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Sharon.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you both. Thank you, Congresswoman Waters and Marla, for that informative and very engaging discussion. And thank you to our attendees for submitting some great questions. Now we are pleased to present remarks from the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, U.S. Representative Raul Ruiz, MD, who will discuss the latest efforts by the caucus to provide equitable economic recovery for Latino and immigrant families and small business.
Hello, my name is Congressman Dr. Raul Ruiz. I represent California's 36th Congressional District in Southern California. I'm an emergency medicine physician and a public health expert with training in humanitarian and disaster aid. I'm also chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I'd like to thank Marla Bilenek, President and CEO of the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, NALCAB, and Clorinda Landeros, Director of Public Policy, for the invitation to give remarks today. I'd also like to thank all the community and economic development practitioners for participating and for working to build strong, equitable communities. Over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen Hispanic families carry the brunt of this public health crisis. Hispanics play a central role in the U.S. economy and have courageously stepped up and risked their lives as essential workers, serving as farm workers, meat packers, caregivers, doctors, nurses, and much more to keep us safe, healthy, and fed. Yet working in the frontline occupations has increased the risk of exposure for many Hispanics in our country. Furthermore, Hispanic immigrants are more likely to be low income and work low-wage jobs that do not offer paid sick leave or employer-sponsored health insurance, and are disproportionately employed in industries hit hardest by the pandemic. In fact, Latinas alone make up 1 in 10 workers in the leisure and hospitality industry. These factors have all contributed to Hispanic Americans experiencing unemployment rates 40 to 80% higher than white unemployment rate, with Latino workers being disproportionately affected. As chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, I can tell you that our caucus is working hard to eliminate these inequities in our economy. We are 38 members strong with 4 senators and 34 representatives who are devoted to improving the lives of Hispanic Americans across the country. Just this Congress, we have helped pass several bills to bolster our economic recovery and help Hispanic families succeed. For example, the American Rescue Plan, which passed both the House and Senate with unanimous support from the CHC, has helped drive our economic recovery and reduce poverty in Hispanic communities by almost 40%. Thanks to CHC member Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez's leadership as chair of the Small Business Committee, the American Rescue Plan has put relief directly in the pockets of small business owners, with a special focus on minority and women-owned businesses through programs like the Community Navigator pilot program. She, along with CHC and Small Business Administration Administrator Isabel Guzman, a Latina entrepreneur, are continuing to collaborate together to bring meaningful changes for the small business community and advance equitable economic recovery. The CHC is also actively working to push diversity across all sectors, including at the Federal Reserve. As the first Hispanic physician to serve in Congress, I understand the importance of diversity and representation and the value of having different perspectives at the decision-making table. Hispanics represent about 20% of the U.S. population, and it is important we have the same representation at the Federal Reserve System to support a healthy economy for households, communities, and businesses across our country. In closing, the CHC is committed to advancing the lives of Hispanic Americans and eliminating the barriers and systemic inequalities many Hispanic families face. Thank you for having me today, and thank you, NALCAB, for strengthening and empowering Hispanic communities. Together, we can create lasting change to ensure the promise of America is accessible to the 60 million Hispanics living across our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Ruiz. Next up, we present a one-on-one conversation between NALCAB President and CEO Marla Bilenek and Montgomery County, Maryland Council member Nancy Navarro, a first-generation immigrant who heeded the call to serve her community, becoming the first Latina elected to the council of Maryland's most ethnically diverse county.
Nancy, I want to thank you so much for making time to talk with me and be a part of NALCAB's Latino Economic Policy Summit. The theme of the Public Policy Summit is advancing economic mobility of Latinos to rejuvenate our economy and shape the future during this nation's post-pandemic recovery and beyond. Today, I would like to discuss with you the efforts you have made on the local level to increase opportunities for Latinos and underserved populations, and hear about your own personal journey and what led you to become the first Latina elected to Montgomery County, Maryland's council. With that, let's start at the beginning. So Nancy, what inspired you to run for elected office and specifically for a seat on the Montgomery County Council?
Well, Marla, first I want to thank you for this invitation. And it's such an honor to join all of you to talk about such an important topic. You know, what inspired me was this very urgent sense of wanting to contribute to my adopted community, because I came to the United States to go to college and planned to go back to Venezuela. And I met my husband, and, you know, lo and behold, we were going to have a child. And I had to really think about what that meant in terms of shifting my life, really. And one of the ways that I felt I could really immerse myself into my adopted country was to find ways to make a contribution. And it started as almost like a project, working with potential family childcare providers, Latino women who wanted to become licensed. And then that snowballed into becoming more aware about things like the academic achievement gap. And then when my own daughter, who is an Afro-Latina, beautiful daughter, was going to enter the school system, a lot of other issues began to cross my mind. And so that kind of, you know, one thing led to another, you know, so PTA participation, lots and lots of volunteer work. And then one day it turns out that there was a vacancy at our Board of Education. And I was literally recruited, you know, and I did that dance of like, me, no, I've never thought about politics. What do you mean? But then when I really sat down and looked at my trajectory and my work, I realized that I needed to be at the table where the decisions were going to be made. I felt that it would be important to bring forward that perspective. And so in 2004, I applied, I was interviewed, and it was a close vote, but I was appointed to the Board of Education in Montgomery County.
Excellent. And I'll just give full disclosure that Nancy is my councilwoman because I'm a resident of Montgomery County, and I've had the pleasure of knowing her for, gosh, I think it's been about 9 years now. And she is just a fantastic powerhouse, and we're so lucky to have her.
Thank you.
So continuing on with the questions, my second question is, you have a track record of achievement supporting economic growth by way of entrepreneurship. Can you tell us what the small business ecosystem is like in our area, and about the initiatives that you've advanced to support entrepreneurs? And of course, I know firsthand sort of what you've done, having participated in a lot of your initiatives as a partner, but I would love for you to share with our audience just specifically what you have done. It's really a model initiative that you created.
Thank you. Yes, so, you know, Montgomery County is such a vibrant place in terms of our small business ecosystem. I mean, we have over 141,000 small businesses. You know, a very large proportion is actually, you know, these are businesses owned by people of color. And so it has been very gratifying to work hand in hand with partners throughout the community to find ways to support our small businesses. And I think one of the landmark projects was the Small Business Assistance Program, which, you know, I introduced a piece of legislation that created this program when Wheaton was about to become, you know, revitalized through an extraordinary investment to really spearhead and really, you know, bring forward an extraordinary revitalization project that now is complete. But there was a lot of worry about the small businesses, especially the Latino-owned small businesses in that area. And so this program literally was very simple. It was to provide technical assistance and actual, you know, money to help these small businesses ride the wave of the revitalization project. And it would start a year before the revitalization project would begin. And I'm pleased to report that this was extraordinarily successful. And we did not see the devastation that sometimes you do see in other types of revitalization projects where those small businesses don't survive the whole entire disruption of construction and all of that. And now this is being used as a model, by the state for other big projects like the Purple Line and some other revitalization projects. But I think going a little bit further, we saw, especially with the pandemic, how devastating it was to see all these small businesses closing, having to just shut their doors and adapt. And so that to me was also a very important opportunity to ensure that we would target funding, whether it was the CARES Act money or ARPA, our own local funding, state funding, to make sure that we were strategic in helping and very targeted and adapted. And so making sure that also we had linguistic and culturally proficient support for our small businesses, because as I said earlier, our communities of color, our immigrant community is, so entrepreneurial. I love the phrase that I keep, I've heard a while back that said, immigrants are by definition entrepreneurs, because, immigrating into another country is by definition a very resilient entrepreneurial activity. And so, we made sure that at least right now we have about $100 million that we've been able to invest in helping our small businesses ride the wave of this pandemic. And that has been, critical. And so there are many ways in which the county has sought to assist our small businesses. When we created the Economic Development Corporation, I advocated to make sure that we would have somebody there that would focus on providing support specifically to small businesses and specifically to businesses owned by immigrants. And they hire someone who is Latino, who is bilingual. And so all of these things are really critical to make sure that this ecosystem remains vibrant because it is an economic engine for our county.
Absolutely. And I really think you should be credited for some of the approaches that have been taken post-COVID, or during COVID, I should say, because we're in the middle of it, because a lot of that was based on the work that was done with the revitalization of Wheaton and sort of the existential threat that posed to the businesses that is actually quite similar to what they're facing now during the pandemic. So I think that was very forward-looking and really helped to set the stage for supporting businesses through challenges like what we're currently going through. So thank you. So next, in 2019, you spearheaded the introduction and adoption of Bill 27-19, the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act, to create a framework to develop a racial equity policy. This law is now being proposed as a model for adoption in the legislative houses in the state of New York. Can you tell us how this came about? What impact do you think it will have socially as well as economically?
Thank you. So, I have been thinking for a long time about this notion of structural changes because, as I said earlier, I joined the Board of Education in 2004. I was there for 5 years. I served as president 2 years consecutively. Then I joined the county council in 2009, and I have been there ever since. Will leave next year because I'm term limited. Also been president for 2 years. And I have to say that in Montgomery County, we're very fortunate because we are always looking at ways to address a lot of the challenges that come our way. The latest, census is showing that right now Montgomery County is about 57% people of color. And so you look at a school system that is 73% of color. You look at Montgomery College, 78% people of color. And so it's a very vibrant, it's a very diverse, I always say it's a microcosm of the country and the world. But the truth is that when you start looking carefully at the persistent disparities, they're very hard to eliminate. Despite all the investment, despite all the years that I myself have served in office, there are still very present disparities. We saw that front and center during this process of this pandemic, how very quickly we identified the zip codes that were most disproportionately affected. And those happened to be the zip codes where we had the concentration of Latino in our African-American Black communities. And so I have been thinking about this for a very long time. I'd also been thinking about this notion of how do we frame our economic development strategic direction. And so in 2019, I was council president. It was a year of a lot of transition, brand new administration after 12 years, a new council with a lot of new members. And I felt that it would be a good opportunity for me to help make that transition, usher that transition. And so I decided that I would dedicate the whole year to adopting the racial equity and social justice law. And the idea would be that we would always have an impact statement with every bill that is proposed, every budgetary proposal, also land use decisions, so zoning text amendments. And also we would ask the school system that when they submit their petition through the executive, which ultimately comes to the council, that they would also include that kind of analysis. And the reason for doing this is because, to me, it's the only way that we can structurally begin to dismantle what has been really institutionalized, racist policies. It is the only way. And so every time that a legislator, a decision maker has to, look at what is in front of them, they will have this information. So you can't say that you didn't know necessarily. And so we've been building up this structure, right? So we have an equity policy officer that is in the executive and the administration. The council also has 3 positions that are dedicated to this analysis. And we started with training as well. Training is mandatory. So it's a whole entire package that is very holistic. Thus far, we've invested about $1 million in that effort. And yes, other jurisdictions like the state of New York, Prince George's County, other jurisdictions are looking at also how to do this, because it's not enough to just have a resolution, or it's not enough to also hire an equity policy officer, right? And say, okay, that person will take care of everything. You have to build an infrastructure. So that's what we have done. And it is tied to the economic development platform that I also proposed after a lot of consultation with the private sector and the nonprofit organizations. And we adopted that in 2019, which basically focuses on 4 areas: transportation, housing, business development, retention, expansion, and workforce development. And racial equity is embedded in that as well, because it makes complete sense, right? It's just logical. If you have a county that is this diverse, if you're not intentional, if you're not strategic, then you are not going to be able to sustain any kind of economic strength. It's the same issue that the country is facing because of the declining birth rate. We have a young population, predominantly of color. So if we want to continue to compete in a global economic stage, we have to invest in these young people, and we have to address these disparities. And so I often say the framing is important, because sometimes we talk about racial equity and social justice only from the lens of civil rights, which is really critical and important, but we forget also how this is going to have a negative effect if we don't address it on our economic bottom line. Unless we decide that we just want to import our talent from overseas, then we're going to be in trouble. And so this was 2019, Marlon, and I say that because I had no idea what 2020 was going to bring, but it was kind of foretelling what was coming our way, which was really extraordinarily, for me, it was just beyond anything I could have ever imagined, because then when 2020 came, we already had the infrastructure in place for our racial equity and social justice. We had our, economic development platform. And then we also had a early care and education initiative that I authored an action plan for 4 years. And that was a blessing, because then when 2020 hit and we had to drop everything to respond to this crisis, at least we had already a lot of this infrastructure in place, as you mentioned, including some of these templates to help our small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just remarkable. And I think maybe you have a crystal ball somewhere because you're really forward thinking on all of these topics. It's really, really impressive. And we're so lucky that you sort of have that mindset, whether it's intentional or not, it's working. And I also wanted to just make note of what you were saying around racial equity and social justice being also tied to economic mobility. That's actually the baseline mission of NALCAB. And so it's so great to see that sort of brought to bear because, it is getting out in the street. It is protesting, it is civil rights activism, but it is also, how do we make sure that economic mobility is accessible to all? And so that's really refreshing to hear.
It is. And one thing I will note is that we are very fortunate in the United States because when you look at the data that's coming out from other developed nations, they definitely have this aging population like we do, right? But they don't have a significant young population. We do. That young population is predominantly of color, okay? And so again, to me, it's just logic that we need to take advantage of this extraordinary resource and this asset in order for us to maintain our competitive edge. Absolutely.
Great. So another thing that I wanted to mention is that your office has led the Latino Civic Project, which is an effort to engage underrepresented residents in the civic process. Can you tell us a little bit about that program and also how it's strengthened civic participation among the immigrant community?
Sure. So in the same theme of structural changes, for many years as I was serving on the Board of Education, especially working, with parents very closely, I would always engage parents, especially immigrant parents, Latino parents, to talk about how they could be involved in the school system because, navigating the school system can be very daunting. And lo and behold, when I was elected to the county council, my district actually, when I was elected, did not have a lot of Latino communities in it. But then it was the redistricting process changed the boundaries. So in 2011, I began to represent Wheaton, which is really the epicenter of the Latino community in the county. And I began to meet with a lot of folks in the community. And very soon it became obvious that parents didn't want to just talk about education. They wanted to talk about transportation. They wanted to talk about healthcare. They wanted to talk about, the environment. They wanted to talk about all these other policy areas. And so that led to a conversation and a couple of meetings to figure out a way to put together a program that would enhance the civic knowledge of this community. We know how difficult it is when you come to this country because perhaps your experience with, governmental agencies back in your home country was not a very positive one, or perhaps it was non-existent. And so, I made the decision to take some money from my budget in my office and hire someone that would spearhead this project. And we worked together and we developed a curriculum. This gave then a way to the Latino Civic Project. We had a couple of conferences. But then the curriculum is imparted in Title I schools, in senior centers, in apartment complexes. And the idea is to literally, it's like train the trainer, like training ambassadors, right? So that when folks go to this curriculum, they can then turn in, towards their community and begin to lead and begin to organize and begin to find their own voices. And so it's been extraordinary. I mean, we've had over 600, community leaders that now are, out there providing that kind of almost like translating, right, what it means to be civically engaged. Mm-hmm. And they have been able to affect a lot of really amazing changes. The Wheaton Library design, for example, it's something that they worked very hard. And they feel really good that they can say, we worked on this. We made sure that this would happen. They come and testify. They can testify in Spanish because we also, parallel to this project, began to change some things, within the county council communications office. So I began in 2011 making sure that we would have subtitles, making sure that we would have a position that would be a bilingual communications person. And then we expanded that to have somebody that can work with our Asian community, that can work with our continental African community. We began to expand that capacity. And now we have an actual translation unit, which is really important because we saw it, especially through COVID, how critical communication was from the very beginning. And COVID also became the stage to launch what is called Por Nuestra Salud y Bienestar, which is a Latino-centric COVID initiative. And that template was also used for our African American community. And we invested upwards of $7 million because we knew that the Latino community and our Black community were disproportionately affected. I can report to you that that initiative, which now has had awards nationally, and I'm really proud of, given that it was something that Councilmember Albornoz and I got together one weekend and said, we need to launch this. This is the template. Let's put it together. Let's get it funded. That initiative is responsible for now the Latino community in Montgomery County having a higher vaccination rates than even our white community, which is something unheard of. And it's because of that whole entire ecosystem of civic participation, of leaders in the community, promotoras de salud, which are also out there coming together and doing this. So to me, this is just so gratifying because it shows that even though it's usually a little more tedious to do that kind of structural work and organizing, it pays off, right? Because whenever you're faced with a crisis, you can count on that very solid infrastructure that you have in the community. And so yes, this Latino civic project to me it's wonderful. We started it in my district, District 4, but then I expanded that into, it's now countywide. So it's being funded as a countywide program. And there's a radio show. We have a Spanish, language radio show. And also during the pandemic, as we were trying to figure out what is the best way to communicate in the immigrant community, WhatsApp. So we establish a WhatsApp account, and that is how, the minute that a press release would come from the governor, we would make sure that it was translated into different languages and disseminated, and it really made a difference, right? And so I'm really proud of that work, and I'm really proud of these, community leaders that took this on and continue to educate and to organize and to empower their own voices to make a difference in their communities.
Absolutely. And I really feel, even for myself as a young adult, civic engagement is a teachable skill. It's a learnable skill, and I think it's just wonderful that it's been, spread like wildfire as you have done. So very, very cool. So now we're going to turn to you, sort of your experience. So in breaking barriers and creating change as the first Latina elected to the council, what barriers did you face and how did you overcome those barriers?
Well, I'm always super honest about my trajectory. And as I said to you earlier, I really wanted to make a difference and make a contribution. So I found out very quickly that, of course, politics, it's very aggressive and intrusive. And even though I thought, hey, I have really good intentions and I'm qualified and all these things, very soon I realized that I was going to have to make a decision because the barriers that were immediately thrown in front of me were just very surprising. And the environment was very toxic. And so I had to make a decision, and I decided with my family that it was important to occupy these spaces, because if we're not there, then, young people looking at what is, out there, then they can't imagine it either. And so for me, it was important to occupy that space. But it was, it was hard, especially at the beginning, very male dominated, trying to figure out the work family balance. When I joined the Board of Education, I had an elementary school child and a middle school child, and it was like trying to balance that. And then when I went to was elected to the county council, it was very interesting because when I joined the county council, we had 4 women serving, and every cycle it went down to the point that now I'm the only woman on the county council. And it's just been really interesting to have to literally on a daily basis. Fight off erasure. I mean, it's real. It's one of those things where also fighting off the stereotypes, right? Because everybody seems to have some, interesting perception of what a Latina woman is supposed to be like, or what women are supposed to be like, et cetera. And so all of that is an added layer that I feel, especially Latina elected officials have to deal with, but women in general. And it's not different from other sectors, right? Where you are in higher level positions of leadership, you're constantly fighting off all of these stereotypes and these perceptions, et cetera. But I have found that it is also important to just be very focused on what it is that drives you. It can't be about you. It cannot be ego driven. It has to be this sense of, look, I'm here to do my best to hopefully role model what it can be like, so that when another, woman comes along, I want to make sure that they don't face the same barriers that I had to face. It is all about breaking down those barriers, paving the way to make it easier. That is really important. And so that's what really, has motivated me, is just this notion of, this is about the collective, is not about me, right? That, if tomorrow for some reason I am doing something totally different, I'll be fine. I haven't plotted out some major, strategic sort of political ascension thing. And I feel like you kind of have to do that, because if not, it can be so overwhelming that it derails your work, and then you're not focused. So I feel satisfied that I believe that the agenda that I came to, to take care of and execute, that I've been able to do that, and now will be to, the next generation of women coming through the county council, to build on that legacy and on that agenda. But I think it's also important to talk about how it's not necessarily a walk in the park, that it's not going to always be this wonderful thing, because you have to be, I think, prepared to be centered enough in order to succeed. If you come in there thinking that it's all just really wonderful, beautiful, and you're the honorable, and it's so great to take photos and cut ribbons, and that's it, you're going to be in for a big surprise, but it's not impossible, and it's necessary. I feel that it's absolutely necessary. So I'm hoping that in 2022, Montgomery County Council will have a lot more women, because it is absolutely, I believe, necessary for sure.
I agree. And I see you active supporting, up and coming candidates. So I hope that your wish comes to fruition, because we definitely need, one and more than one Latina or female on the council. So coming back to sort of this issue of barriers, earlier this year, you were part of a very unfortunate incident that took place where some support staff that were on a live hearing, not realizing that their mics were unmuted, commented on your accent in a disparaging way. And the incident actually made national headlines. You handled the situation with incredible grace. What do you make of that experience? And were you surprised that these attitudes and biases still exist in 2021?
When I first heard of what had happened, because I didn't actually hear it, because of course I was talking, and I was actually very emotionally moved, because I was responding to a comment that our health officer had made regarding the disparities, right? How people in the Latino and our Black communities were dying at higher rates, had higher infection rates, and how the state wasn't providing the support necessary. And he, who was also a state employee, kind of put his job on the line when he made that comment. And so I was supporting and validating what he had just done, because he had just become very vulnerable. And when we hung up for closed everything off for lunch break, then I got the calls, because there were reporters that were listening that heard the comments, et cetera. So at first I was stunned, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. I thought it was kind of like, are you kidding me? But then it began to, it just started to sink in the meaning of all of this, the implications of all of that. Because here we were having spent a whole year working on racial equity and social justice in order to, reach the point of legislation. Here we were talking about people dying, right? People's lives devastated, who were predominantly Latino and African American, and what that meant and how we had to respond to this. And here we are in this institution that has a lot of power. The Montgomery County Council is, we're 9 members. We make all the legislative decisions, pass all the laws. We add to the budget. We make all the land use decisions. And we have a budget that is $6 billion. So this is a very powerful body. And I started thinking about the fact that here we have staff that is supposed to support the members, that are there to make recommendations many times, right? And if this person was making these comments in such a flippant way, it seemed like it was a very comfortable space. What were the implications of this in terms of the culture of that institution in a county that is over 50% of color? And so all of that to me, all of that came together to say to me, okay, this cannot be tolerated. And this is a teachable moment. And I think that's what resonated with so many people, Marla. I had people from Panama contacting me, your home, yes, saying, I saw it on CNN in Espanol, people I knew, right. In Great Britain. I mean, it was just all over because it touched everybody in a particular way. I had reporters say to me, I have an accent, and I have to tell you, for a long time, I used to kind of shrink a little bit, but now I'm not going to do that anymore. Or people that said, I didn't apply for that job because of my accent. I thought maybe it was so extraordinary how it resonated with so many people. And so I saw it as such. I saw it as a teachable moment. And I wanted people in our county and the state and the country to know that you should never, ever, doubt yourself because you have an accent, or because you're of a different color, a different ethnicity, or your name is, Navarro. It's like, no, you need to own that with pride and your head up high and go. But for the institution itself, I'm still working on making sure that this gets addressed. It has to get addressed, because how can we actually serve our residents appropriately if this is the kind of toxic environment within that institution that has and holds so much power? That is still something that I hope, we can address fully, because in my opinion, it has not been addressed fully. But it was definitely, as I said, it was a teachable moment, and it was a lesson for me too, in terms of understanding that, this is still out there, and you just have to keep, as I said, moving and working to dismantle all of these structures as much as possible.
Absolutely. I think it's a huge wake-up call for a county like Montgomery County that, prides itself on being relatively progressive. To have something like this front and center is a wake-up call. And I'm really, glad that you saw it as a teachable moment and took the opportunity to use it as such. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. And I think it's important to call things for what they are. That's how we grow, so the county is an amazing place. And if we can make it better, that is what we should do.
Absolutely. So I think we're in closing right now, but I would just like to ask, I know you said you don't have, huge political aspirations ahead, but what is next for you, Nancy? Where will we see you next? Oval Office?
Well, I am, of course, we're still in the middle of the pandemic, so we're still very focused on that. But I think before the end of the year, I still want to stay involved. I still want to work, public service is my passion. So I think before the end of the year, there might be an announcement coming. Stay tuned.
Well, I will be staying tuned for that for sure. And I just want to thank you so much. This is personally, so wonderful for me that you could join. And I'm so glad to have you as a focal point of our event. And I'm just so glad that so many people across the country will hear about the incredible work that you've done for our county and hopefully look into it further and replicate it in their own communities. So thank you so much, Nancy. And I look forward to hearing what you've got in store.
Thank you, Marla. And I want to, absolutely let you know how much gratitude I have towards you, because you have led and framed something as important as economic sufficiency and attainment and entrepreneurship. And that is the key. And so from one Latina to another, I thank you and I honor you as well. And I'm so proud of what you continue to do.
Thank you. Gracias, Nancy. Thank you.
Claro que sí.
Ha sido un placer. Thank you.
Igualmente, saludos.
Okay, igual.
Ciao.
Wow, what a personal and impactful discussion from two truly inspiring Latina leaders. Thank you both. Next, let's venture slightly south to hear from Senator Mark Warner of Virginia about ongoing initiatives to provide greater access to capital for Latinos and communities of color.
Hi, I'm Virginia Senator Mark Warner, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a few ideas with you today. First, I want to congratulate NALCAB on your second annual conference. Clearly, promoting the needs of the Latino community is more important than ever now. We've seen in the recent census data that the Hispanic population in America has grown literally to close to 20% of our whole population. Clearly the fastest growing demographic in America. And I think that's good for America, and I think that's good for obviously the Latino community as well. But we've got to make sure, if we continue to see this level of growth, that there are issues of access to capital that are fairly addressed across the board. Again, this is where NALCAB comes in. And your effort of particularly working with CDFIs, community development financial institutions, and other minority depository institutions is really so important. This has been a passion of mine since before I was senator. I bring a private sector experience as a venture capitalist where I worked with a lot of entrepreneurs of color. And I'm very proud of the fact that last November, in the last of the COVID relief packages, I was able to secure $12 billion to support CDFIs, $3 billion of it going out in grants, $9 billion of it going out in Tier 1 capital in the so-called ESIP program. And I hope many of the NALCAB affiliated CDFIs have made those applications. I also continue to work with my friends on the Small Business Committee about other initiatives that we can work on to try to provide greater access to capital for communities of color, with a particular emphasis on the Latino community. So I commend the work that NALCAB has done. I hope you'll count me as an ally on other initiatives, because making sure there is fair and equal access to capital for all Americans is one of the ways that we make sure that everybody in our country gets the fair shot that they deserve. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator Warner. We are going to wrap up this fantastic morning of political activism and insights with a call to action from US Congresswoman Linda Sanchez of California. Let's hear what she has to say about voter rights and steps to expand protections for voters of color.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Linda Sanchez, and I represent California's 38th Congressional District. The right to vote is at the very core of our democracy. It's written into our Constitution, and Congress has a duty to protect it. But for centuries, very few Americans had access to the ballot box, and we continue to see the effects of this injustice even today. Right now, we're seeing attacks on voting rights across the country, but especially for voters of color. Many state legislatures continue to pass laws that target Black and Latino voters. We're seeing new restrictions on early and absentee voting that are specifically designed to stop working moms and dads from casting a ballot. And obstacles to registration are being put up across the country, all in an effort to keep people from exercising their basic right to vote. Too many brave Americans have fought and sacrificed for our right to vote, and many more came before them who never even knew what it felt like to fully participate in our democracy. We can't let them down now. This moment calls for bold action, and that's exactly what my colleagues and I are fighting for. This year, House Democrats passed 2 bills that would dramatically expand protection for voters of color. The For the People Act creates national standards for our elections and makes voting more accessible for working families, not less. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act restores many of the reforms put in place by the original Voting Rights Act, and it institutes new ones to combat the voter suppression tactics that we are seeing now. Together, these bills would ensure that every voter has equal access to the ballot box. But we need to do more. We need to increase resources for voters whose first language isn't English. Immigrant communities, like many in my district in Southern California, are often shut out of the democratic process simply due to the language barrier. They have the right to make their voices heard, just like any other American citizen. The fact is, this country is becoming more diverse every single day. Latinos are the fastest growing minority group in the country. In California, Latinos make up almost 40% of the population. Our vote is powerful, and we will not be silenced. Because when our community shows up, we help determine the direction of this country. Voting allows us to build the future that we want. Good paying jobs, excellent education, and financial security for our children. Things that our parents and grandparents only dreamed of. So we will keep fighting, and we will not stop until every American can freely express their right to vote. I want to thank the National Association of Latino Community Asset Builders for inviting me to participate in this event today. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in and engaging in this important conversation. Thank you all, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Sanchez. What a great morning this has turned out to be. And thank you to everyone who has contributed to the chat and social media posts. Remember, our hashtag is Latino Economic Engine if you'd like to comment on any of the topics that have been touched on today. Now we're going to take a lunch break, and we will see you back here at 12:30 p.m. Central Time for what is sure to be a provocative and lively public policy discussion with a group of industry leaders that will offer us their expert insights. You're going to want to be a part of this in-depth discussion, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. We will see you all back here at 12:30 Central Time. Hello, and welcome back to NALCAB's Latino Economic Policy Summit, Leading America's Recovery. We want to thank everyone who has contributed with social media posts, and please remember that our hashtag is Latino Economic Engine if you would like to comment on any of the topics that have been touched on today or ask questions. Up next, we'll present a public policy panel discussion focused on diversity and breaking barriers, led by NALCAB's Director of Public Policy, Clorinda Landeros. Clorinda leads our organization's public policy work and is located in our Washington, D.C. office. She is a seasoned public policy professional with more than a decade of legislative and policy experience. Clorinda has served as legislative director, deputy chief of staff, and as committee staff in Congress. She holds a master's degree in public policy and administration from Northwestern University. Please welcome to the virtual stage, Clorinda Landeros.
Good afternoon, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us for NALCAB's Public Policy Summit, and welcome to this discussion. Today we're going to talk about creating a fair society and how diversity and inclusion in federal public policy is critical to advancing the economic mobility of Latinos. The Latino community contributes significantly to the cultural and economic fabric of this nation. Latino entrepreneurs, for example, create nearly 87% of all new businesses, stimulating economic growth and driving job creation. However, we've seen the disproportionately negative impact the COVID pandemic has had on people of color, and we've seen their exclusion from and inability to access government relief programs. This has highlighted for all to see what many of us already know, that people of color continue to face systemic barriers to opportunity, and in this case, well-being. On his first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. He said that equal opportunity is the responsibility of the whole government. Today, we'll talk about what this means, strategies to achieve this, and what's at stake. Promises like this have been made before. So if you're wondering, will change actually happen? How's public policy and our government a vehicle for this? If those questions have crossed your mind or are crossing your mind right now, you're in the right place, and we're glad that you're here, because it's going to take all of us to make this happen and to see real results. Today, I'm joined not only by experts in government and public policy, but our panelists are leading by example in creating an America that's fair. I'm truly excited to introduce them to you. We'll have time at the end for question and answer, but feel free to type in your questions at any time in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have with us Lizette Flores. Lizette is a program manager in the Community Relations and Minority Affairs Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. The OCC ensures that national banks comply with our laws and operate in a safe and sound manner. Prior to joining the OCC, Lizette served at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in the Office of Community Planning and Development. She holds a bachelor's in political science and Latino studies from DePaul University and a master's degree in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois. We also have with us Dr. Michael McAfee. Michael is president and CEO of PolicyLink, a national research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity. Before joining PolicyLink, Michael served in the Chicago Regional Office of HUD, where he helped create more than 3,000 units of affordable housing, 5,000 jobs, and ensured access to social services for more than 200,000 families. During his time at PolicyLink, Michael has played a leadership role in securing Promise Neighborhoods as a permanent federal program. This program targets education outcomes in distressed communities, and he's also helped facilitate the investment of billions of dollars to neighborhoods in concentrated poverty. Michael earned his Doctor of Education in Human and Organizational Learning from George Washington University and completed Harvard University's Executive Program in Public Management. And next we have Araceli Panameno. Araceli is the Director of Latino Affairs at the Center for Responsible Lending, a national organization working to ensure a fair financial marketplace. CRL focuses on those who may be marginalized or underserved by the existing financial marketplace, or in many cases, people who are targeted for abusive financial products that leave them worse off, including people of color. Araceli is an expert on issues impacting the financial security of Latinos and other communities of color. Since 2004, she helped formulate policy recommendations, foster coalitions, and educate decision makers. She's also an author of Invoque, a Spanish language newsletter on issues impacting Latinos and financial markets. She serves as an advisor and is a member of the Insight Center for Community Economic Development's Experts in Color Network, Closing the Racial Wealth Initiative. Prior to joining CRL, Araceli worked in Latino women's health, migrant workers, education, and immigration issues. Welcome to the virtual stage, and thank you for being here with us today. Now, I would like to turn it over to our panelists to answer a question that all of us need to know, and that is why right now it is particularly timely and opportunistic to address racial equity in government and federal policy. Let's begin with Lizette, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Clorinda, for that question. And thank you also especially to NALCAB for holding this important discussion. So here is what we know. Economic inequality has been rising in the US for decades. Over the past 25 years, the wealth gap has increased. Minority homeownership rates have remained stagnant. Minority unemployment has outpaced white unemployment, and millions continue to be either unbanked or underbanked. The pandemic has only exacerbated these trends, and Latinos have been hit especially hard. Latinos, and specifically Latinas, are overrepresented in the essential workforce, and Latinos are also the lowest paid essential workers. The CDC says that the risk of COVID infection, hospitalization, and death is 2 to 3 times higher for Latinos than it is for whites. And more than a third of Black and Latino adults say that they're doing worse off financially now than they were before the pandemic. Vulnerable and underserved communities have endured disproportionately higher unemployment rates and business closures. And although Latinos are starting business at a higher rate than the national average, they still don't have adequate access to capital and credit. A recent study by Stanford showed that the credit approval rate for Latino-owned companies was 60% lower than it was for whites. So this data is making it increasingly clear that we have a financial system that has worked for some, but has left others out. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, we'll go to you next.
Thanks for having me. I want you to hold a number. 100 million people, 1 in 3 people in the United States are economically insecure. The majority of those folks are people of color. So the reality is this: if you care about results, if you open your mouth to say, I want a good return on investment, you have to own the fact that you actually can't get there without addressing racial equity. The design of this nation is why you have 100 million folks struggling to make ends meet. It's not by happenstance. And it's not because these people are lazy and don't want to work. It's because of the structural barriers that intentionally were designed to exclude them. Now, the thing that I'm excited about when I think about the daunting task of addressing that 100 million number is this. There's never been a time when all 3 sectors, civil society, government, and business, have come to racial equity. We're here now. And there's also never been a time where we've had a mature equity movement with leaders of color and white folks who get this work, who are boldly leading on it. And so the reason why you should deal with racial equity is because racial exclusion was baked into our founding documents. Racial exclusion has been designed into our laws, our regulations, our customs, and even our institutions. And now, if you want to change that, You cannot do so by just wishing that we all can just get along, that somehow we can just be colorblind and excuse what has happened in the past. Absolutely, we have to govern for the all. But I want you to take one simple example, the racial wealth gap. I hear everybody talking about closing that racial wealth gap. Well, the reality is this: the racial wealth gap was based off of public policy that built the white middle class. And today we think that simple charity will close that gap. It will not. Where I live, in the 1970s, you could buy a home in Berkeley, California, one of these big mansions over here for $170,000. Today, they're more than $6 million. So there's no way that people of color can catch up when you gave them a public policy advantage, white folks a public policy advantage. And so what I want you to begin to think about is your aspiration matching what we know about the design of this nation? And if not, it might be time for a reality check. We can make progress. We are making progress. We can get results. But in order to continue to get the results at the scale that is needed in this nation, we must tend to the design challenge of it, and we must tend to being so bold to center racial equity and to never step away from it.
Thank you. Araceli?
Thank you so very much, NALCAB, Clorinda, and my co-panelists for this opportunity to address you this afternoon. My co-panelists have said so much. In the Biden administration, as you articulated it, Clorinda, upon taking office on January 20th, acknowledged that closing the racial gaps in wages, housing credit, lending opportunities, and access to higher education would increase our nation's gross domestic product by $5 trillion over the next 5 years. I could not agree with that more. But it will take significant investments to undo the harms that Michael has already alluded to, which have 240 years in the making, right? Policies of discrimination and disadvantage. And for the purposes of this conversation, I want to mention at least 3 buckets of policies that have actually contributed to this wealth gap that I actually referred to as the Grand Canyon. And so to address that, right, to make sure that we have equity of opportunity and shared prosperity, I believe that we need to have access to education and training that leads to good jobs with benefits. We need to deal with discrimination in employment and address the wage gap. I believe that we need to have access to home ownership that addresses most significant barriers, which is the down payment issue, as well as the housing supply and access to fair terms of mortgage capital. And finally, the other piece of this stool, I believe, is access to business capital under fair terms. On education, for example, our communities have made significant strides, and we have actually advanced significantly in terms of our graduation rates from high school and graduating with a college degree. However, we're still lagging behind. Only 16% of Latinos 25 years of age and older have a bachelor's degree or higher. And also the other point that I want to make on this issue is that for the cohort in 2010 who was seeking to get a bachelor's degree, only 50% of our men and 58% of our women completed their degrees, which then means that young men and women of Latino background separated college, likely with student debt, without the benefit of a degree that will allow them to get them a good job. And for those who completed, they did so with student debt that places them in a negative equity position, difficult to get out of, and that impacts their ability to move forward. On homeownership, it has already been mentioned. This pandemic and the previous recession that we experienced has set us back. We were initially targeted with toxic products. We barely got to 50% homeownership rate. And then we slid back, losing a lot of ground. 66% of our wealth was lost in the loss of our homes at the time. We are now at the risk of also losing our home ownership and also for our renters to get evicted. We need to address these issues. And then finally, for small business, in the small business world, as my co-panelists have already articulated, we were impacted severely, along with African Americans, along with Asian Americans, and we're facing significant challenges tapping into those resources that are available, that our government makes available. And so we need to have solutions. And as it has already been said, we have this time where civil society, government, and the private sector have now agreed that it makes business sense, right? It is right to do good by consumers, and particularly those of us of color, right? It is good for the bottom line to do so. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Araceli. The three of you have done a good job of articulating the need of the moment. And I'd like to go back to the group, the full group right now. And I'd like to hone in on the moment and talk about, I mentioned earlier President Biden's executive order. Michael, I'd like to ask this next question to you. In July, over the summer, PolicyLink released a blueprint for how to advance this executive order called "For Love of Country, a Path for the Federal Government to Advance Racial Equity." Could you tell us about that report and what inspired the development of it?
Sure. For Love of Country was inspired by the Biden administration doing something rather transformative, acquiring the language of equity, centering racial equity specifically. And this has been our work in this movement for more than 22 years at PolicyLink, and we wanted to be sure that the administration was successful. But we also wanted to ensure that as equity becomes ubiquitous, it does not get watered down. You know, oftentimes people take up equity work in a soulless way, but this is soul work. And we wanted there to be an artifact out there as federal managers and leaders come to this work to know authentically what it means. But it was also to push back on people who think that we're burdened with the problems that they're burdened with. I'm not burdened with the curse of wanting to exclude. I'm not burdened with having racism running through my veins. And so I wanted to make sure we had an artifact out there that said, you know what? People of color love this country just as much as anyone else. And we love it so much that we're going to own it. We're going to own it now. As this nation becomes predominantly a nation of color, we're going to own it, and we're going to participate in how we govern. The Racial Equity Executive Order is not an initiative. It is the fundamental essence of government. It is the fundamental essence of government, and that's what we wanted to center. And so For Love of Country was a way for us to center that frame and then to begin to walk hand in hand with some of the agencies to ensure that they are successful implementing the Racial Equity Executive Order. Now, the last thing I'll say here is this. We're not delusional about what this administration is going to be able to accomplish with the very close votes in the House and the Senate and a very toxic environment right now. And so For Love of Country really is a commitment by PolicyLink to a 20-plus year journey to compel the nature and the logic of our federal government to change so that it can serve all, so that it can aspire to reaching the aspiration in our equity manifesto, the all in the equity definition. And so that's why I'm excited about it, because we get a chance to start a journey, same way Grover Norquist did when he talked about no new taxes. We get a chance to compel our government to love everyone in this country. That's what that document undergirds.
Thank you. You mentioned working with agencies and giving them the tool or directing them. Luckily, we have Lizette, who does work at an agency. And as someone, Lizette, inside the government, in the Minority Affairs Office, you're working to help bridge that gap for minority communities. Could you tell us why you chose the OCC as your place to advance that work? And maybe give us some insight into what the agency is doing to advance the president's executive order.
Sure, thank you. So as you mentioned, it's the Office of External Outreach and Minority Affairs at OCC. We are a small but mighty team. We have actually only 3 permanent full-time staff at the moment. And we advance racial equity in a number of ways. First, we engage stakeholders on matters affecting economic stability and financial access in minority communities. Some of those issues might be fair lending, community and economic development, minority homeownership and business ownership, access to credit, and others. We coordinate and execute high priority agency initiatives that reduce barriers to financial inclusion, such as Project Reach, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. And we also lead various programs to increase Latino representation in government and at OCC specifically. We've got several diversity internship programs that we manage on my team. We've got the High School Scholars Internship Program, which recruits youth from DC public schools to come work at OCC for a summer internship. And we also have the National Diversity Internship Program for college students that also recruits students to come work at OCC. And one of our partners in that program is HACU, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. We also have an employee network group called HOLA, and I'm lucky enough to serve on their Human Capital Committee. So I assist in recruiting Latinos to increase Latino representation at OCC. And lastly, we provide technical assistance to minority depository institutions, or MDIs. Just last week, we held our interagency MDI and CDFI conference that provided best practices, policy discussions, and tools for MDIs to be successful.
So I know that recently it was, I want to say maybe last month or a month before that, NALCAB's president and CEO, Marla Bolanek, participated in the Minority Affairs Roundtable at the OCC with leaders for, I believe, organizations that serve minority communities. And the discussion was financial services and the impact banking regulations have on under-resourced communities. I wonder, what does the OCC do with the insights that come from events like that? What is the next steps once you hear from stakeholders and we do these roundtables? What happens next?
Thank you. So the Minority Affairs Roundtable is just one example of how we engage and solicit impact from our stakeholders. And we were really lucky to have Marla join us. Her insight was very valuable. And luckily, OCC has been fortunate enough to work with her before from when she was with the Latino Economic Development Center. So we have had a strong partnership with her for a few years now. As you mentioned, yes, several organizations participated in the roundtable. Aside from NALCAB, we also had Unidos US, the US Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Aspen Institute's Latinos and Society program, the Woodstock Institute, and LEDC. And we hope to continue these roundtables with Black, Asian, and Native American leaders in the future as well. But we take note of all the feedback that we receive during these roundtables, and we make sure we share it with senior staff. One of our biggest priorities in holding these types of events is developing partnerships with organizations and community members so that we get to know who they are and what the needs are, and so they also get to know who OCC is and what we do and the ways that we can engage together. For the Minority Affairs Roundtable, our acting comptroller, Michael Sue, attended, along with several other of our senior OCC staff. We also had our Director of Minority Affairs, Andrew Moss, our Senior Deputy Comptroller for Bank Supervision Policy, Grivetta Gardenier, and our Deputy Comptroller for Community Affairs, Barry Whitus. So when we hold these events, top leadership is there, and they are actively listening and paying attention.
Thank you. And I don't mean to have you in the hot seat, but if I could, one other question that came to mind while you were speaking is, Thank you for sharing everything that the OCC is doing. Sometimes it's not easy to get that information. And for those that are not leaders of these organizations, those maybe watching that are students or not even involved in public policy, how can they weigh in with the OCC? Or how can they learn about what is available, what tools or assistance and information is available, all those things you just mentioned?
Sure. So for anyone who's watching or listening, please reach out to us with your concerns and participate in our outreach events, and become familiar with OCC and our team specifically. I always joke, I personally had never heard of OCC until I applied for a job there. And when we do community outreach, this is actually very common. A lot of people have never heard of us. So I do encourage you to become familiar with our agency. You can visit us at occ.gov. We also have a website called Help with My Bank. So if you are having an issue with your bank, you can contact us and notify us as well. But just in general, become familiar with who we are, go to our website, and once we have outreach opportunities, we'd love to engage with you.
Thank you. That's perfect. Thank you. I want to shift gears here a little bit and go to Araceli on Section 1071. Section 1071, and we'll talk about a specific policy. Section 1071 of Dodd-Frank and the Wall Street Reform Act, as you know, requires that the federal government collect lending data for women-owned, minority-owned small businesses. I think that this provides a good example of holding the government accountable on issues that will help advance racial and economic equity. For those that don't know Section 1071 of Dodd-Frank, what that is, can you tell us what that is and why CRL and you have taken such a vocal leadership role in advancing that, working to get it implemented and then weighing in on the rule?
Thank you for that question, Clorinda. And before I go to Section 1071, I want to bridge this, I want to create a bridge, if you will, between what we in the advocacy community, research community do, and those who represent agencies such as the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. So the OCC is also tasked with doing charters of national banks and financial institutions for that are applying for a particular charter. And what we are asking all of the regulators, as we focus on racial equity, is that those charters be granted to financial institutions that are living up to the mission for which they are being created. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because recently there was a company that goes by the name of Opportune that has actually applied to the OCC for a national charter. And we have yet to hear about this application. However, many of us are concerned because this company claims to benefit Latinos across the country, and yet it utilizes the court system to intimidate the most vulnerable consumers among us, namely the immigrant population. So I would just encourage those of you who are listening to make sure that you pay attention to the rulemaking and to the processes that these regulators and these government agencies have to take over to make sure that our voices are heard. With regards to what you just mentioned, the Section 1071, this is the technical terminology for a law that was passed 11 years ago. The Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010, dearly known as Dodd-Frank for its co-authors. This particular section is 11 years in the making, for which rulemaking has not taken place. It actually asked the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created as a result of the passage of that law, to actually undertake rulemaking in this space. And why do we need rulemaking in the space of small business lending? Well, let's take a look at what has transpired the last year, the last 18 months since the pandemic started. All businesses were forced to make decisions. They were shuttered or they were ordered to shut down because we are in the midst of a pandemic. And so this has put in very harmful place businesses, particularly businesses owned by people of color, businesses owned by women, businesses owned by those communities that have not had access to business capital and capital markets. But how do we make the case that those programs that the government is creating, in the case of the pandemic, the CARES Act went into effect last year, and it created this program called the Paycheck Protection Program, to the tune of $800 billion, Clorinda. And so the question is, of these $800 billion, how did Black businesses fare? How did Latino businesses fare? How did women-owned businesses fare, etc.? We do not know the answer to that question. We have to do a lot of calculations, a lot of scrubbing of data, multiple data sets to actually get answers as to whether or not the investments that our government has done of public dollars actually went to help our community. And that is the predicate for why we, in the beginning, said we needed to have a data collection similar to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which was put in place in 1975, and it collects data on mortgages. We said we needed to have something like that in the small business lending space. It has taken 11 years, but we are here now. There is a proposed rule, which we will be discussing a little later in the conversation.
You mentioned a good point about that I wanted to follow up with. What would you say to people who maybe are uncomfortable giving that information to the government? I know that with PPP, you talked about the Paycheck Protection Program. It was optional. Like they didn't require that demographic data, but they made it optional. And for some people in our community, particularly immigrants, may not feel comfortable, sharing even more information with the government. What would you say to them?
So precisely what I've shared today, right? Our government is making investments of public dollars, and we need to make sure that those public dollars are actually serving the interest of all our communities, including ours. And people were nervous, yes, because we have no data collection and reporting requirements. So business owners are not used to, if you will, providing that information. However, if I can draw a parallel, if you go and apply for a mortgage loan, the mortgage application process will actually ask all mortgage applicants to provide that information to the lending institution. And so today we have this data set, which represents approximately 85% of all mortgages originated on an annual basis. And we have a good sense as to how lending institutions are providing or not providing access to mortgage capital to communities. That's very important because we have something in our country that is called fair lending laws. We have something called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And without data, we are unable to prove whether or not we are being discriminated in financial markets. And small business lending is an investment in community development. It's an investment that actually reduces the number of people that have to resort to unemployment because it's a creator of jobs, right? The mantra in our country is that small businesses are the backbone of our economy, right? They are the job creators. And so we need to make sure that those jobs are being created in our hometowns, in our communities, in our backyard, that our people have access to those jobs and to those investments.
Thank you, Araceli. Speaking of government programs, I'd like to ask Michael you a question. I have heard you speak previously about the need for raising your voice and being heard. And I've heard you say that it's not only important to be heard when it's safe, but also when it's bold, aspirational, and maybe a little bit scary. And because of that, I'd like to ask you a question that could maybe help us all be a little bolder and aspirational. A recent COVID relief program through the Small Business Administration, the Restaurant Revitalization Program. This was a $29 billion program that provided resources to small food-based businesses. This program faced legal scrutiny for its race-conscious approach. For the first 21 days after the launch of the program, Congress limited grants to priority applicants. These applicants were women, veterans, or socially and economically disadvantaged people. The court ruled that the government provided little evidence of past discrimination against these groups to whom it had granted preference. And ultimately, the SBA stopped processing priority applications ahead of non-priority. Now, I mention this as an example because other race-conscious policies may face challenges in the future. In this effort to rebuilding or dealing with the framework, like you mentioned earlier, of our policies and our government, what would you say to those that are discouraged by this, by seeing this? They might think, here was a program that was addressing racial inequity head on, and it faced legal scrutiny. If something is challenged in court, does that mean the effort was a failure? Or is there value in drawing attention to our legal system and how they assess policies? What are your thoughts on this? That's a lot.
Yeah. We should not consider that a loss. Structural racism is confounding, and this is the height of it being confounding. You know, race-based policy built this nation, and now it's being used against us. And the reality is simply this: we have to advance a new legal and regulatory frame if we want to do our work. The civil rights laws, as you can see, are being whittled away, and they're insufficient for what we want to do. And so really what these court cases are signaling is the work for our generation. So if you ever wanted to do transformative work, this is it. You know, when I talk about the design of the nation, this is a perfect example. If we do not redesign our legal and regulatory, our laws and regulations, we can't do our work. Now, that is exciting because that is structural, and that's what so many of us came into the field to do. Now, what I also tell you is this: we should keep advancing these laws. We should keep fighting for race-based policy. You know, aspects of the right now who are trying to deny me and so many who look like me the right to vote don't really care if it's going to pass in the courts. It's a setup for a future strategy. Same way you see what's happening around women's reproductive rights. It's been a long, hard 40-year battle to get to this place in Texas. These folks are choosing to participate in this democracy at the structural level. I don't begrudge them. That's their right, no matter whether I like it or not. What you see me signaling, it's also our right to participate in this democracy at the structural level as well. And we've got to stop running away from it. Too many times when I'm in meetings, folks say we don't want to pay for advocacy. Well, hell, you just told me you don't want to get results. And this is why. This is why. You can have all the nonprofits and companies that you want. You can talk about all the capacity that you want. But when the legal and regulatory framework of a nation gets in the way of you delivering, it almost makes our nonprofit sector irrelevant beyond providing immediate relief to people. And we're better than that. It's not a critique of the nonprofit sector. What you hear me simply saying is this: others don't get to choose how we're going to advance an agenda that talks about the all, but doesn't shy away from racial equity. That's our choice to make. And we need to stop being cowardly in letting others who show us every day that they will advance race-based policy and don't really give a damn about what I think about it. Voting restrictions in America is race-based policy. The reproductive restrictions today is race-based policy. What are we talking about? So we should stop being ashamed of folks who are going to be upset with us simply because we're working to make sure everybody can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential in this nation. And so what I'm asking folks to consider is if you read that for love of country document, it begins to signal these are the things that we got to pay attention to. The unsexy aspects of mastering democratic governance, getting into the bones of the laws and the regulations and figuring out how to begin to make those tweaks. If we do that, we're going to end up winning. But we've got to want to do that work and stay to it for 20, 30, 40 plus years. That's why I said it's the work of our generation. But the beauty is the work is clear now. We know what it is. We have an amazing critical mass of leaders who can do this work. And we also have the institutional heft to stay in it until we win.
Thank you. To dig a little bit deeper on that, many watching this conversation will have knowledge and lived experience of being excluded from our country's political, social, economic systems that promote advancement. You make it clear in your report, which I thought was important to note, the importance of not using class as a proxy for race. And I think that is something to keep in mind too when we are looking at policies and legislators are writing their bills. So could you expand on why you say that and give us an example that highlights the importance of the difference?
Well, first, it's quite simple. Why is it that when we care about our issues, people tell us we shouldn't care about our issues? So you got to stop letting people dictate what you think about and what you care about. I mean, that's where you got to start. You got to stop allowing other people to shift you off your square when it comes to your issues. You know, the outcomes that we have are based on race-based policies. That's a reality. And as soon as you talk about equity, people want to run to everything but the thing that built this nation, racial exclusion. Why is that? I want people to sit with that. Why do you want to run and talk about transgender rights, talk about women rights, talk about all sorts of other intersections? All of those things are important, and we should hold every last one of them. But stop acting like race is just an aside. It's not. It is as fundamental as the air we breathe in this nation. And Raj Chetty's data proves it. Basically, his data says the American dream is dead for most of us. You know, if you factor in income and wealth, educational status, that Black boys who grow up in the same conditions as white boys, if you control for that, are going to end up worse off and most likely slip back into poverty. So when you look at the Opportunity Insights data, what it's showing you is pretty much the zip code that you're born in is where your butt is going to stay. Doesn't matter how much education you get. And then even if you are of color and you make it into the middle class, it is highly probable that your children will fall back into poverty. That's Raj Chetty's data, one of the most preeminent scholars out here that we hold up in terms of the rigor of his analysis. So what you hear me really describing is we are smart enough to hold all intersections. We don't have to fight amongst ourselves about them. The thing that I'm asking people to consider is stop running away from this one, because I can hold race, I can hold sexual identity, I can hold gender. Those things are not a problem for me when I do my work. There are problems for folks who are uncomfortable with the legacy of what their ancestors have done. And that's not my cross to bear. My cross to bear is to making sure that I can get into this notion of making sure all, that 100 million, every last one of them, are better off. And this is an important point, because you can become so educated and so fancy that you are a fool. And right now, running away from race when we see what happens, we just saw it in the pandemic. We just saw it. We just heard our panelists describe ways in which the design of these programs did not serve us well. So the reality is, if you want an accountable nation, if you want a nation that is really being responsible for the wise use of taxpayer dollars and getting results with them, you've got to hold the complexity of race and the complexity of all of these intersections. And that's really the burden of our generation as well. We don't get to hold just one of them anymore. We've got to hold them all. And yes, it is hard to govern for the all and take care of folks who have a legacy of being excluded. And that's why I say, and this is the last thing I'll say, is I won't get a chance to heal. I will not get a chance to heal. I will not get a chance to heal because I'm in this seat now that requires that I care about every single person in this nation. And that's a hard pill to have to swallow when your people have missed so much opportunity and prosperity because of the design of the nation. But so many of us who are in our roles right now have to just accept that we will not get a chance to heal. And we have to be the ones who have the grace to see it through, to see through making sure that we're not excluding anyone in our work and the design of a future nation that is equitable.
Thank you. I want to open this up because all three of you work to make our government more fair in different ways, but that's all what you're doing. And we can't ignore it. And Michael, you brought this up earlier a little bit. We can't ignore the politics of the moment, the current moment. And what we are seeing in Congress is gridlock. I mean, we see this with the fiscal year 2022 funding bills that haven't made it through Congress. There's that continuing resolution. We see the infrastructure bill, getting postponed, and there's still not an agreement on the reconciliation package, and we're trying to move things off of it and make it smaller. Do you get discouraged in your work? And how do you maintain hope in the face of that? To anybody who wants to answer that.
I'll wait and see if my colleagues want
to. I'll get started. So I do not get discouraged because we try to break things down in pieces that are achievable and attainable to move the ball forward, right? And so I will continue to go back to the Paycheck Protection Program, significant investment of public dollars. We started off in a very, very bad place. The plane was being built as it was flying. So it was already a challenge. You had to keep up. The burden was placed on business owners who are experts at their business. They are not experts at regulation. And so financial institutions were actually held harmless while the burden of understanding rules that were being made and changed on the fly was put in place over the shoulders of business owners. But we did not give up. NALCAB, Center for Responsible Lending, Policy Link, and many other organizations came together to advocate for our communities and to say to Treasury, to the administration, and to the Small Business Administration that change needed to take place, that we needed to collect data, that things needed to actually be shifted around. And we made changes that made the program better. So case in point, there were 2 rounds of funding that took place, one last year, one this year. Last year, everything, the data collection piece that I had mentioned was voluntary. Only 11%, less than 12% of those who apply for a loan actually submitted race, ethnic data, as well as veteran status and gender data in total. And this was paltry, right? Because again, it was voluntary and nobody was actually emphasizing that this was an important matter. When this administration came in, we continued the advocacy in the Small Business Administration, and Congress were willing to listen. We were able to make changes. And by the time the program ended at the end of May this year, we had 33% of loan applications submitting ethnic data. 29% of loan applicants were also submitting race data. But then this also means, you see, that we have still an incomplete picture, which is why Section 1071 is so important. And we look forward to working with NALCAB and with all of my colleagues on this panel to make sure that we bring that change about, because we need to make sure that funding is made available to our communities. So I don't lose hope. I am hopeful because change is possible. Slow, but possible.
Michael, is that any thoughts on that about politics of the moment and feeling discouraged, or maybe do you feel discouraged?
I'll answer. I will say yes. At times I do feel discouraged. And I think part of that comes from, at least in my specific work, when I'm supposed to be conducting outreach to communities of color and I am a government employee, communities of color, there's a lot of mistrust in the government. So it's very hard for me, I identify as a Latina first, right? I'm a Latina, then I'm a government employee, to bridge the gap and get people, especially communities of color, to want to trust the government, to trust our projects or initiatives or priorities, and even just to get people to the table. I can't count how many times I've reached out to organizations and just radio silence on the other end, when really what we want to do is engage. So I will ask, if we reached out to you before, or if you have an interest in engaging with us, please do so, because we do want to develop a partnership.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and I would say I don't get discouraged as much, but I do get really I get depressed sometimes, and I get very angry because I'm an intuitive person, so I can feel the pain that others feel. And while I may be blessed, um, think about what's been happening at our nation's border. People seeking a better life. Think think about what's happening with our democracy. Folks wanting to participate and can't. Think about what happened in a pandemic. We call people heroes, and then we debate whether they deserve $300 or not. Think about what happened in a pandemic where we have more than 5 million people facing imminent eviction because we thought so little of them. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to do this work when your government and so many in this nation hold a hostile disposition towards you when you've done nothing to them. And each and every day you're expected to get up with a smile on your face and continue to do this work. I mean, that's a hard pill to swallow. That's a really hard pill to swallow. But the beauty is, and the reason why I don't get discouraged is because we were born out of this struggle. We were born out of this struggle. And these things will not stop us from thriving. And I chuckle sometimes at just the futility of trying to crush people of color's spirit, because it ain't happening. It's not happening. And so while it makes me depressed at times and it makes me angry, I'm buoyed by our strength of what our grandparents and our parents gave us. And that's why I say, racial equity and people of color, we're actually this nation's salvation, whether they know it or not. We keep making it better in spite of, and we'll continue to do that. And so at the end of the day, I don't fully become so disillusioned in this work because of what I see happening all over this country every day. And that's probably the biggest blessing, that I get to bounce around the country and I get to see the amazing work that is happening. This nation has leaders of color and white folks who have joined in a multiracial coalition who are doing profound work. My colleagues on this panel, profound work. Folks in our communities, profound work, whether it's tenant protections, police use of force bills, rezoning of housing laws. The perfecting of this democracy is happening. We're just in the muck and mire of it. And so when I think about how bad I have it some days, just trying to move an agenda, I think about so many folks who never will be blessed to be in the positions that we're in. And it's not because they're not smart. It's simply because they were denied the opportunity. And so, I just want us all to think about how sad it is that folks out here have to try to crush a group of people's will that they'll never be able to crush. And that's why they're so angry today. Think about it. You're crushing people that keep rising. You're crushing people who keep rising. And now, because of your animus, this world is even too toxic for the majority of white people. When I talk about that 100 million, 48% of it is white America. So you harm me at your own peril.
Wow, thank you. I'm getting pinged that we're running short, close on time, so I want to at least get one audience question that's coming through the chat. Federal agency rulemaking can be pretty complicated. Do you have any resources or tips to share to help small staff at small nonprofits understand and be able to engage in these processes? Araceli, you may be able to, since Section 10, that is a rule, Section 1071, maybe you want to take that question?
Thank you. Yes. And I want to say, right, to segue from what Michael was just talking about, we ourselves stand in the shoulders of giants that came before us, right? As a person of immigrant descent to this country, I have the blessed opportunity to be here with NALCAB and with all of you discussing these very important issues. And if it wasn't for those that came before me, I wouldn't be able to do this. With regards to the question related to what can we do to make it easier for nonprofit organizations? Join coalitions like NALCAB, join organizations like PolicyLink, like Center for Responsible Lending, institutions like the OCC and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Part of their task is to do rulemaking. And when they are charged to do rulemaking, it can be a very daunting process. Section 1071, for example, was just released the 1st of September of this year, a month ago. Yet it has to be published by the Federal Register. And once it gets published in the Federal Register, a clock will start ticking of 90 days of public comment period. So we are on borrowed time, if you will, to dig more into it, to have a better understanding of what it does, and to begin to frame how we are going to chime in, how we are going to comment to this rule. Let me mention that the rule itself is 916 pages. So actually working in coalition with partners like NALCAB, like PolicyLink, and like others in coalitions is essential. It's important because we can divvy up the task and make it manageable, make it doable, make it possible. So engage, and take action, right? Do not wait until the last moment. I know that with NALCAB, we are working on developing information about Section 1071. We will be doing webinars. We will be doing and creating opportunities for NALCAB members to engage. And so seek who your partners are. It gets easier when you work together, and we are stronger when we work together as well.
Thank you, Araceli. An hour is not enough time to talk to the three of you, and I'm seeing we've got 2 minutes. I want to get to the last question to give a takeaway in 30 seconds or less, because we're down to 2 minutes. What is one thing you would like our viewers to do as a result of this conversation to join in the movement to advance equity in federal government and public policy? I'll stop talking. What is one thing that you would like them to take away from this and act on? Why don't we start with Lizette?
Sure. So I would say reach out to our office, respond to our invitations. A lot of people not only are unfamiliar with OCC, but they're unfamiliar with our specific office. OCC is the only regulatory agency with a dedicated Minority Affairs office, which is completely separate from our Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, our OMWI office. And our Minority Affairs office is actually part of our executive front office, which highlights the level of importance that these issues are to the agency. So I would say check out our website, reach out to us, and please engage. There are a lot of resources on our website that may be of use to you. You can, like I said, Help with My Bank is one of them. You can find newsletters, information of our current initiatives like Project Reach, which unfortunately we ran out of time on, and I would love to discuss. You can also go on our website and find the status of different licensing applications if you're interested in that. And reach out to me if you have any questions. The email is eoma@occ.trej.gov.
Thank you, Lizette. We can go in the same order, Michael.
Yeah, I would ask people to continue to use their voice to hold institutions accountable. Even when we're not in a pandemic, there are trillions of dollars that are flowing to community every day through entitlement programs and competitive grants. And we should be demanding that our elected leaders can show outcomes for those dollars, outcomes to those most in need. And so we should continue to do that. And we should also continue to raise our gaze to believe that we can play a significant role in redesigning this nation. That type of work is critical. And so we can hold providing immediate relief to people who need that right now. And we can also hold doing the liberatory work to make charity less needed because we've designed a nation that is more just and fair. So I would ask us all to be more courageous in our vision, to be more courageous in thinking about how do we step into our power and use our own personal agency to enact something different. And that I want you to think about if you don't do these things, there are others out there who want a very different world. And we should not begrudge them. It is their right to participate in this democracy, as you heard me say before. And what I want us all to think about is how does our right manifest to create a world where all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential.
Thank you. Araceli?
So there were three things that I mentioned in my opening remarks that I presented to you as the pillars for a shared equity and for shared prosperity. And that was education. And so with regards to education and student debt, I'm going to ask you to contact the administration and ask President Biden to enact debt cancellation, student debt cancellation, because it harms our communities, Black and Brown communities in a significant way, and it keeps us from going forward. With regards to homeownership, we need down payment assistance. Congresswoman Maxine Waters in the US Congress, she's the chairwoman for the House Financial Services Committee. She has a bill called Down Payment Towards Equity, with a $100 billion investment in down payment. That will help us increase homeownership for our communities. And then with regards to small business, I want you to get engaged on commenting regarding Section 1071. Get in touch with NALCAB, get in touch with PolicyLink, get in touch with Center for Responsible Lending, and find a way to make sure that you are engaged. El consumidor involucrado no puede ser ignorado. Thank you.
Lizette, Michael, Araceli, what a pleasure it has been to have this conversation with you. And to those of you watching, we hope that this has inspired you to act and help join the movement to promote policies for a more just economy that works for everyone. With that, it is my honor to introduce our next speaker, Isabel Guzman, the Administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration. Isabel Guzman serves as the 27th Administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration, where she represents more than 30 million small businesses in the United States and is a voice for the nearly 1 in 4 new businesses that are started by Latinos. As the daughter of a small business owner and an entrepreneur herself, Administrator Guzman knows firsthand how important small businesses are to the communities they serve, the people they employ, and the economies they fuel. Professionally, she has been a steadfast advocate for making the American dream of entrepreneurship accessible to everyone. One of the first things she did in her role as SBA administrator was to improve and expand the COVID Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program to better meet the needs of small businesses, especially those owned by women and people of color who, because of long-standing barriers to capital markets and networks, have suffered disproportionately from the pandemic. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Administrator Guzman to our virtual stage.
It is such an honor to join the National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders Latino Economic Policy Summit. NALCAB's efforts to advance economic mobility in Latino communities are so important, particularly as we emerge from this once-in-a-generation pandemic. NALCAB's network of 120 mission-driven organizations continue to have impact. I look forward to partnering with you to help more Latino entrepreneurs start, grow, and sustain their small businesses. Entrepreneurship is my lifelong passion. By growing up in a small business family and being an entrepreneur myself, I know firsthand the hard work and agility that it takes to start and grow a small business. And I've seen and endured firsthand the barriers that stand in the way. My experiences have only strengthened my resolve to empower all small business owners with the tools and support they need to achieve their American dreams, and in the process build dynamic neighborhoods and communities that are the scaffolding for our reimagined economy. As the voice for America's 32 million small businesses and innovative startups, I want all entrepreneurs to feel like the giants they are in our economy. I joined the Biden-Harris administration as part of the most diverse cabinet in history to focus on equity, as I believe the future of our economy depends on us leveraging our diversity. This is exemplified in the Latino story. Latinos are highly entrepreneurial, starting businesses at the highest rates to help power the American economy. Yet, as we know from a Stanford study, there is an opportunity gap of $1.4 trillion a year in our economy, since lack of investment in Latino-owned businesses leads to less revenues. And COVID has highlighted the inequities further. Latino businesses suffered disproportionate impacts from the pandemic, and many were left out of early rounds of relief, as we know. Nearly twice as many reported revenue declines during the first year. As part of the Biden-Harris administration's government-wide focus on equity, the SBA is working hard to break down persistent barriers to capital, markets, and networks to help all small businesses build back better and fill those gaps. I've asked my dedicated team at the SBA to find new ways to connect with our smallest and underserved businesses and meet them where they are. The future of our nation's economy depends on our ability to help all our small businesses recover and rebuild. We need great ideas from everywhere and anywhere to have the chance to succeed. Together, we can build a better, more equitable future. Juntos somos más. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you again, Administrator Guzman, for your remarks and for your service on behalf of this nation's entrepreneurs. And now, our next speaker is going to highlight an opportunity to join in on efforts that will help advance the economic trajectory of Latinos. A chance to ensure that people of color are fully and meaningfully represented in the United States Congress, and to safeguard the equal opportunity of voters of color to elect candidates of their choice. The Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, also known as MELDEF, is the nation's leading Latino legal civil rights organization and is committed to protecting and defending the rights of all Latinos living in the United States and the constitutional rights of all Americans. It is my honor to introduce our next speaker, Thomas A. Saenz, President and General Counsel of MELDEF. Thomas Saenz leads MELDEF's 5 offices in pursuing litigation, policy advocacy, and community education. This is actually his second time with MELDEF. Before rejoining the organization in 2009, Mr. Saenz counseled previous Los Angeles City Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa on policy and legal matters. Before that, he was lead counsel on many of MELDEF's civil rights cases in the areas of immigration rights, education, employment, and voting rights. Some of his notable victories include the successful challenge to California's anti-immigrant Proposition 187 and the 2001 challenge to California's congressional redistricting. Mr. Saenz is also the vice chair of the Leadership Conference and Civil and Human Rights and is a graduate of Yale University, where he earned his law degree. It is my pleasure to welcome Thomas Science to our virtual stage.
Thank you, Clarinda, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for the work that you continually do to improve the prospects of the Latino community. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the most important civic engagement opportunities our nation and our community faces. That is the process of redistricting. Now, many of you may have participated in campaigns last year in 2020 to ensure that the entire Latino community was counted in the census. Now, there were many challenges we faced in that count, including delays precipitated by the pandemic, including unprecedented efforts to manipulate the outcome of the census, in particular to decrease the count of Latinos. That included an attempt to add a citizenship question for the first time since 1950. It included attempts to discount entirely certain immigrant populations in calculating representation in Congress. But despite those challenges, which were overcome, we had the results released, the first results from Census 2020, released in the middle of August. And to no one's surprise, at least within the Latino community, it showed what we expected it to show: dramatic growth of our Latino community. In fact, 51% of the nation's total growth in population came from the Latino community. That's extraordinary. We now account for 19% of the total population, but accounted for 51% of the growth in the last decade. And those statistics are mirrored in states across the country, including some of the states that we would ordinarily look at. For example, in the state of California, where I sit today, 69% of the growth of the state of California in the last decade came from the Latino community. In Texas, half the growth of the population, the total population of a growing state, came from the Latino community. More than that, 98% of the growth of the state of New Mexico came from the Latino community. But beyond the states that we would typically look at, those national statistics indicated that we are growing as a population in virtually every state in the country. For example, 2/3 of the growth of the state of Wyoming came from the Latino community. Over 2/3 of the growth of the state of Oklahoma came from the Latino community. There are a number of states, including Illinois, Connecticut, including Louisiana, Mississippi, West Virginia. These are among the states that would have lost population but for the growth of their Latino communities. Now, that important effort to get out the census was grounded in concerns around future funding for our communities, as well as political representation. And that latter, political representation, is a process that we're engaged in today across the country. Indeed, there are really only two Constitution-derived purposes of our decennial census. The Constitution first dictates that we conduct a census every 10 years to determine how to redistribute seats in our US House of Representatives. So in April, we learned how those seats would be redistributed, the 435 seats in the House of Representatives. There were gainers and losers. Most significantly, for the Latino community, the state of Texas, again, grew by 2 seats. Unfortunately, the state of California, and those are 2 largest, most populous states, California and Texas, each have today Latino populations of about 40%. But the state of California lost a seat in the House of Representatives for the first time in its history. That's largely a result of insufficient growth in non-Latino communities in the state of California. But that reapportionment, reassignment of the seats in the House of Representatives is actually just a start to the other constitutional purpose of the census. The US Supreme Court, in a series of decisions in the 1960s, concluded that every state was constitutionally required to redraw its political districts after each census to ensure relative equality in population among the districts. Now, that rule of equality translates in the context of congressional seats to literally having 1-person difference maximum in population between congressional districts within a particular state. So every House seat, US House seat in the state of Texas has to have the same population within one person to every other House seat in the state of Texas, for example. That rule of equality also applies, however, to state legislatures, to local city councils, school boards, other special district boards. Anywhere we use districts to elect representations, they must be redrawn to reflect relative growth of population. This has meant for our Latino community that every decade since 1981, the release of census data has indicated tremendous opportunity to increase our chance to elect candidates of choice, primarily through the creation of Latino majority districts, Latino majority US House seats, Latino majority state legislative seats, and at the very important local level, Latino majority seats on county boards, city boards, and school district boards. All of that occurs through our redistricting process. And with the release of the detailed data used to redraw districts in the middle of August, we are now in the midst of this effort everywhere in the country. Some states, Illinois, Oregon among them, have already adopted their districts for statewide seats. Others, like the state of Texas, are in the very midst of finishing their adoption of maps. Other states, like California, are just getting started, but they too, by the end of October, will be far along in achieving the redrawing of their districts. This is a critically important process. Why? Because, as I mentioned, our opportunity in the Latino community since 1981 has involved advocating and obtaining the creation of Latino majority seats, whether in the US House, state legislatures, or in local bodies. The problem, however, is that ordinarily creating Latino majority seats means that someone who's currently in power, who does not have the support of the Latino community, is going to lose their seat if those Latino majority seats warranted by the growth of the Latino population are created. You all know that folks don't give up power easily or often voluntarily. So it takes a tremendous effort of advocacy and input by communities, and sometimes, frankly, litigation in court to ensure that the growth of the Latino population is reflected adequately in the creation of seats where Latino voters have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. This is why it's so important that all of us, all who are community leaders, involve their communities in the redistricting process. It's easy, and sometimes the media feeds this perception, it's easy to perceive redistricting as a very inside politics exercise, only taken up by elected officials and wannabe elected officials. But in truth, redistricting is very much a process of the people. Those who draw the lines, whether it's legislators themselves or increasingly independent commissions, depend on and need, and sometimes even when they don't want it, they should receive broad community input on the creation of new districts, not just to ensure that the Latino community and its growth are reflected fairly in how those districts are drawn, but also to ensure that various communities of interest, however defined, remain intact and together in a district, whether for the House, for state legislatures, or for local bodies. So this is very much a people's process. It's hard because it only happens every decade, and often in the intervening years, people forget about the importance of redistricting or how best to be involved. Now, MALDEF and others have resources available. Our website is at maldef.org. We have resources available for folks who would be interested in participating, providing important input to the redistricting process. Certainly, it's all going on now, more concentrated this year because of the delay in the release of census data occasioned by the pandemic. Ordinarily, we get the data in April. We didn't get it until August this year. So it's all happening in a very concentrated fashion, but now is the time to be involved. However, it's important to note that this process will continue, particularly if we end up in court in MALDEF or in other organizations challenging the failure, as mandated by the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, to create those Latino majority seats where the population warrants it, and there are differences in views between Latino and non-Latino communities. I will reiterate, it is a legal obligation for redistrictors to create these seats where there is racially polarized voting, meaning that Latinos and non-Latinos vote differently, have different preferences in elections, where there's racially polarized voting, and it is possible to create compact Latino majority districts. The Voting Rights Act requires that they be created. So this is a process beginning now, and we have to take advantage of this opportunity, but it's also a process I hope you will pay attention to throughout ensuing years, as too much of this ends up contested in our courts all the way up to the US Supreme Court. But I invite you all to involve your communities, to involve yourselves in this important redistricting process, whether for the US House of Representatives or state legislatures, or for the all-important local bodies making decisions that impact our community every day. I would now be very happy to take any questions about the importance of this redistricting process. Clarina?
Thank you, Mr. Stein, for sharing that information with us. And we appreciate you taking the time to answer a couple of questions that came in while you were speaking. The first one is, do you know any specific resources that people can take locally that are seeking more information about their state's redistricting process?
So there are a number of organizations whose websites can inform you about the specifics of your state's process. In most cases, state redistricting, which means drawing the lines for US House districts and for your state House and state Senate, in most states that's still accomplished by the state legislature itself. Unfortunately, that often means they're not very open about receiving input, but they do provide opportunities that folks should take up. At the local level, and in some states, you often have independent commissions, non-elected officials who are charged with at least drawing the initial maps. In some cases, those commissions have the power to implement their maps. In others, they're creating advisory maps to ultimately be approved by elected officials. So there are a range of processes in place. So I urge you to look at your own state's websites, your own locality's website, but there are a number of organizations, including MALDEF, but other civil rights organizations and civic engagement organizations like Common Cause, League of Women Voters, that have resources available that can help you to learn about the specifics of the process. I realize this is all happening very quickly, but if we can ever assist, please reach out to MALDEF at info@maldef.org, but look for those resources and get your voice heard.
Thank you. I think that is a perfect question or a perfect response to end on. I know we're running out of time. I wish we could have gotten to more questions. Thank you again for all that information. And if we could put in the chat the websites that he mentioned, that would be really helpful. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you again. And now I will hand it back over to my colleague, Sharon Garcia.
Hello. Thank you all for joining us for today's second annual Latino Economic Policy Summit. If you missed part of today's summit or would like to refer back to any of our discussions, a recording will be available early next week via our Facebook page, or you can also view it on our NALCAB YouTube channel. Please be sure to mark your calendar for our 2022 national event on September 6th through the 9th, taking place in Washington, D.C. Stay tuned for more details coming up in the coming months. We also invite you to visit our website, nalcab.org, to stay up to date on the latest trainings and webinars, news, research, and funding opportunities. Thank you again for joining us today. Signing off, I'm Sharon Garcia for NALCAB. Juntos somos más.